Chapter 51, A Paradise on Earth. Swan Lake. On February 22nd, the weather was clear and sunny. At noon, I took Kunkin and continued building the road, this time extending westward along the sugarcane grove. Along the way, I finally stumbled upon a lake. The forest ahead suddenly opened up, revealing a vast expanse of grassland. Not far from the grassy area was a lake, its waters shimmering like blue crystal. The only word that floated through my mind was, beautiful, so beautiful. The surface of the lake rippled gently, resembling a giant mirror reflecting the blue sky and fluffy white clouds. Surrounding the lake was flat grassland, with tall grass swaying gently in the wind. To the north, the ground rose gradually into hills, while the southern terrain was more undulating and obscured from view for now. I led Kunkin northward and climbed up a hill. What unfolded before me resembled a landscape painting from the Tang or Song dynasty, the azure sky adorned with a few scattered white clouds, the lake's surface crystal clear and tranquil, and a nearby willow tree with soft branches swaying in the breeze. The grassland teemed with life, as herds of goats meandered peacefully, as if echoing the line, "The sky is vast, and the wilds are boundless, the wind blows and the grass lowers, revealing cattle and sheep." I was deeply captivated by this poetic and picturesque natural scene, lost in its beauty for quite some time. Eventually, I returned to my senses and made two important discoveries. I had found a freshwater lake in the habitat of goats. The visual shock and spiritual joy lifted my spirits. I happily ran down the hill with Kunkin and arrived at the lakeshore. Along the way, the goats grazing in the grass were startled by the playful Kunkin and vanished into unknown thickets. The lake water was crystal clear, and the beautiful scenery surrounded me, with trees, the lake, and lotus flowers harmonizing perfectly. I couldn't help but counter the saying, "Clear water means no fish," for I clearly saw schools of fish swimming nearby. Although I couldn't identify the specific types, I could tell that the fish were quite large. This lake had become not only a paradise for fish but also a haven for many animals. I quietly observed the lake for a while, and besides the goats, I spotted freshwater shrimp, pond snails, wild rabbits, swans, wild ducks, small birds, insects, and more. The colorful mandarin ducks were particularly stunning. Water is the source of life, and I was convinced that this lake gathered most of the island's wildlife. Perhaps, hidden deep within some thicket, there were even large predators lurking, watching me closely. Thinking of this, I became alert and walked to a sparsely grassed area to look around, but I didn't find anything. These natural predators wouldn't be easily detected by me. I regretted not bringing my longbow, which would at least give me some sense of security. There shouldn't be any crocodiles in the lake, so I circled around its edge, trying to choose open areas with a clear view. After careful observation, I didn't see any floating objects resembling dead wood, which eased my mind a bit. After all, I planned to come here often to catch freshwater fish, especially since Kunkin loved eating them. After observing for a while and finding nothing particularly noteworthy, I returned to the entrance of the woods and cleared away the nearby grass to ensure an open and safe view. That day, I worked until dark, and at night, Kunkin and I slept in the nearest, A-shaped wooden house. I felt that this place was very suitable for living. The lake view was delightful, and lying here during the day would be incredibly comfortable. However, the plan to relocate was not urgent, as the food supply at my current camp was very stable. There was an abundance of fish resources in the rocky area on the beach, and the potatoes in the fields were nearing harvest. Moreover, I was already familiar with the terrain in that area, and after a long period of exploration, I hadn't discovered any dangerous factors. I planned to thoroughly investigate the situation around Swan Lake before considering moving. On February 25th, I spent 3 days repairing the road leading to Swan Lake. Yes, I gave this lake a romantic name, Swan Lake, and built an A-shaped wooden house at the entrance. On February 26th, I caught a large carp at Swan Lake, weighing about 7 or 8 pounds. It took me quite a while to reel it in. Catching freshwater fish is different from catching sea fish. Sea fish usually bite down hard when they feed and rarely escape. You just need to toss the bait into the sea and feel for movement on the fishing rod to reel it in. Freshwater fish, on the other hand, are much more cautious. They gently test the bait to confirm there's no danger before taking a bite. Therefore, when fishing for freshwater fish, people often use a float to determine if a fish is hooked. I didn't have a float, but luckily, the lake was clear, and I could see the carp biting the bait, so I was able to reel it in. I only ate a small portion of the fish, the rest was consumed by Kunkin. Kunkin was completely different from Bear Big. One bear liked to eat freshwater fish, while the other preferred salted fish. I guess this was because animals also need to supplement their salt intake. Bear Big found it hard to get enough salt in the wild, while salted fish was rich in salt and satisfied that need. Kunkin didn't have to worry about this because I always added fine salt when I cooked. Speaking of Bear Big, I have to mention a recent thrilling incident. About half a month ago, Bear Big unexpectedly appeared before me, and it was the first time it had come so close. It ignored me and walked straight toward Kunkin. The two bears sniffed each other, as if confirming their identities. Soon, they recognized each other and began to play, with Bear Big frequently nudging Kunkin's previously injured leg, as if checking whether it had healed. The two bears played from noon until afternoon. As the sun was setting, Bear Big stood up and headed north, with Kunkin following closely behind. Seeing the two bears getting farther away, I immediately panicked, fearing they would leave me behind. I hurriedly called out, "Kunkin, where are you going?" Kunkin stopped at the sound and turned to look at me. Bear Big also paused and let out a growl, as if urging, "Son, hurry up and follow me." Kunkin hesitated, looking at me and then at Bear Big, seemingly making a choice. I anxiously shouted again, "Kunkin, come back quickly. Dinner will be ready soon." Whether it was because of my words or our emotional bond, Kunkin ultimately chose to run back to me. Bear Big watched this scene, stood dazed for a moment, then turned and walked away alone toward the north until it disappeared into the forest. I felt a twinge of guilt, but I would never back down when it came to Kunkin. At the same time, I silently said in the direction Bear Big had vanished, "Don't worry, Bear Big. I will take good care of the little guy. Come play often, there will be plenty of salted fish." Chapter 52, Building Swan Lake. February 27th, the rainy season is approaching. I've built a woodshed beside my wooden house specifically for storing firewood and charcoal. The previous storage room had become a bit cramped as more items piled up, food, pottery jars, and charcoal, creating an unsanitary environment. The charcoal often left everything blackened. Today, I roasted 3 batches of charcoal simultaneously using the traditional earth roasting method. Once these batches are successfully completed in a few days, they should last me for over 6 months. February 28th, today, during low tide, I took Kunkin with me to gather clams by the sea. To my surprise, Kunkin got one of its legs stuck in a crevice between the rocks. It took considerable effort to rescue it. Fortunately, its leg was fine, but it was yelping in pain. February 29th, today, I returned to Swan Lake to clear a wide path through the waist-high weeds. This project was neither too big nor too small, and it took me 3 days to complete. I first cleared a path about 2 meters wide with my machete and shovel, extending from the entrance of the forest to the lake's edge. Then, I gathered some smooth stones to line both sides of the path and build a simple fence around it. I believe that only a carefully crafted path like this is worthy of the beautiful scenery of Swan Lake. The grassland by the lake is vast, covered with exceptionally lush grass that has wide, long leaves. It would have been nice to have a lawnmower, but all I had was my machete. So, I swung my weapon to cut down the grass. I didn't intend to uproot all the grass, as that would strip this sacred place of its sanctity. Instead, I trimmed the tops to about 30 centimeters above the roots, allowing the grass to continue growing without harming the ecological environment here. While cutting the grass, I often heard animals scurrying in the nearby thickets, occasionally accompanied by the sound of mi and tilde mi and tilde. These agile goats would vanish into the grass before I could spot them. March 5th. After several days of effort, I cleared a spacious area in the grass around Swan Lake, covering about 3 acres. The grass was arranged so neatly that it resembled the exquisite lawns of a French manor. I plan to build another house here, spacious and sturdy like my current wooden house, but even more magnificent and luxurious, transforming it into a villa. This time, I intend to use a more diverse range of materials and carefully design the structure. This will require considerable time to gather materials. Unlike the urgency with which I built my current wooden house due to the lack of a sturdy shelter, there's no rush here, I can prepare at my own pace. So, I devised a new plan. I will work on the forest road on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, while Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays will be for cutting trees and gathering materials to build the villa, reserving Sundays for rest. For the remainder of today, I leveled a patch of ground by the lake at Swan Lake, constructed a fishing platform with wooden sticks, and surrounded it with a railing for future fishing. March 6th, I find myself increasingly wanting to try those bleeding goats, so I went to the mountainside to dismantle all the rope traps. Upon reflection, the locations of these traps were poorly chosen, as few animals ventured nearby. I reset these traps in the grassland, adding 2 more using vines. Now there are a total of 9 traps, and I believe I will have success soon. March 7th, it rained heavily all day yesterday, continuing into the night. I didn't work outside but enjoyed a leisurely day with Kunkin, Xiao Yuer, and Kong Kong. March 9th, yesterday, there was a light drizzle, but this morning, after the rain stopped, I discovered a long-lost coconut crab on the beach. This crab wasn't as large as the last one, but it was still incredibly delicious. I picked the largest leaf from a tree, cut a hole in the coconut, poured the chopped coconut crab into the coconut filled with coconut juice, added a bit of salt and chopped lemon, and covered it to steam. The taste was phenomenal, sweet and sour, fragrant and rich, truly unparalleled. I wondered where these giant coconut crabs usually hide. In my time on the island, I've never found their nests, capturing only 2 after rainy days. Kunkin and I savored the meal, and in the afternoon, we headed to the mangroves, planning to indulge our crab cravings again. This time, I also took advantage of the low tide, which is the best time to catch blue crabs, as the paths are easier to navigate. We didn't use a bamboo raft because it was time-consuming and unnecessary. In the mangroves, I marveled once again at this peculiar landscape. It resembled a magical world from Harry Potter, full of enchantment. The trees grew beautifully and oddly, their roots intertwined and firmly anchored in the muddy seawater. With more experience this time catching blue crabs, I learned that if you grab them by their back legs, you won't get pinched. Their pincers move differently from other crabs, so don't try this lightly. Kunkin, having learned from its previous, painful lesson, obediently stayed to the side while I caught the crabs, refusing to make a move. I picked up a blue crab by its back leg and pretended to approach Kunkin's bare face, which scared it away in a panic, resembling a frightened puppy. I thought to myself, could this guy be a bear dog? When Kunkin and I were both covered in mud, we finally caught 8 huge blue crabs. I had a clear target, capturing 4 males and 4 females. The males had a gelatinous crab paste, while the females had rich crab roe. Both were delicious in their own right. As I tied up the blue crabs with vines to prepare to return to camp, I spotted a colorful wild chicken. Its long feathers shimmered with a metallic sheen, appearing quite majestic, and it had a bright red comb on its face, pecking at a clam on the ground. I picked up a stone, intending to sneak up on it and deliver a fatal blow. I didn't have my bow and arrow. But before I could get close, the wild chicken spotted me and took an aggressive stance. Surprisingly, it was quite feisty. Unfortunately, when Kunkin roared and charged at it, the chicken flapped its wings and vanished, leaving only 2 or 3 fallen feathers. Chapter 53, The Goat. March 10th. Early in the morning, I set out to the mangroves with my bow and arrow, intending to track down the wild chicken that had provoked me yesterday. Unfortunately, the tide hadn't receded yet, so there were no signs of wildlife. After lunch, I chopped some wood and transported it to a clearing by Swan Lake. As I passed a patch of grass, I heard a hurried, "Min. Min," coming from within. I paused to listen carefully. Wow. This was the spot where I had set the rope traps a couple of days ago. I quickly bent down, pushed aside the grass, and made my way toward the sound, with Kunkin following closely behind, clearly excited, as if we were about to sneak into someone's field to steal potatoes. Normally, I didn't need to hold on to Kunkin. It was obedient and knew to stay by my side. Recently, it had grown significantly, almost reaching my chin when standing. Its limbs were sturdier now, and its claws resembled 2 large fans. Its fangs had sharpened, making me cautious during playtime, wary of an accidental bite. Soon, I reached the trap and discovered an adult goat. Its hind leg was firmly caught in the rope, and it anxiously circled the trap while bleeding restlessly. Unfortunately, it was alone. Even if there were companions nearby, they wouldn't have the sense to help it escape. "What a big goat!" I exclaimed, my eyes lighting up as I swallowed hard. Since coming to the island, I hadn't tasted goat meat. I hadn't eaten pork either. It had been nearly a year. The meat I had consumed the most was either wild rabbit or little Jerry. I was practically tired of mushrooms by this point. Now, with such a sizable piece of kebab before me, how could I not be tempted? Despite my hunger, I didn't rush forward to subdue the goat. Those sturdy horns were likely sharper than my spear. This appeared to be an adult male goat, with large, curved horns, a characteristic of males, while female goats have shorter horns. Since my goal today was to chop wood, I only had an axe with me. I hadn't brought my bow and arrow or machete. I decided to return to camp for my tools. I tugged at Kunkin, who was eager to go, dragging it along. Although it had grown significantly, the sharp horns of that wild goat could inflict deadly injuries, so I didn't dare let Kunkin take any risks. I ran quickly, and thankfully, the path was repaired. It took me just over 2 hours for the round trip. I was out of breath, worried the goat might escape. Fortunately, it was still stuck in the ropes hanging from the branches, seemingly exhausted, standing there with its trapped hind leg, motionless. I returned with my bow, arrows, and machete and began to strategize. I considered shooting the wild goat from a distance, but I would need to fire multiple arrows. I wasn't a sharpshooter. I couldn't guarantee a hit on its heart with a single shot. By the time I managed to kill it, the goat might have already turned into a hedgehog. At the same time, I was very interested in the goat's skin and fur. For some reason, whenever I saw animal fur, I felt the urge to preserve it completely. So, I abandoned the idea of shooting it and opted to use the machete. If I could strike its neck, I could end its life quickly, but I also had to avoid being gored. The only reason I felt brave was that the goat looked very weak, as if its earlier struggles had drained all its strength. I was deceived by its appearance. This would ultimately cost me dearly. After a while, I tossed aside the bow and gripped the machete tightly, summoning my courage to approach the goat quietly. The goat seemed a bit nervous, its legs shifting uneasily, subtly preparing to charge at me. I paid no attention and lifted the machete to the right side of my face. If someone had been watching, they might have thought my movements resembled those of an Eastern swordsman. I slowly approached the goat with the raised machete, but it didn't react much at first. Just when I thought the goat was exhausted and too weak to fight back, it suddenly charged at me with a powerful leap, its legs forming a bow shape, lowering its head to aim its horns at me in one swift motion, leaving me no time to react. Immediately, I felt a numbness in my legs and lost my balance. I didn't feel pain at first, but my mind instantly registered, "This is bad." I was careless. The goat still had strength and must have sensed the danger, unleashing its potential at that critical moment. Suppressing my panic, I forcefully plunged the machete into the goat's neck, but I couldn't maintain my balance. The machete struck off course, merely creating a shallow cut on its neck and failing to deliver a fatal blow. Nevertheless, the startled goat knocked me down to the ground and backed away a few meters, clearly preparing to charge at me again, this time aiming for my abdomen as I lay on the ground. Just then, a black shadow suddenly darted out beside me. Seeing me injured, Kunkin let out a loud roar. This was the first time I had seen Kunkin so enraged. It bared its teeth, revealing its fangs, and swiftly pounced on the goat, sinking its teeth into its neck. With the momentum, Kunkin tackled the goat to the ground, its sharp fangs instantly causing the goat to bleed as Kunkin shook its head and let out a primal growl. As for what happened next, I didn't look back because I was tightly clutching my injured right leg. There was a bleeding wound on the outside of my thigh, and pain radiated to my brain, causing me to break out in a cold sweat. I tore my pants and saw that the wound was deep, but thankfully it wasn't very large. The goat had only gored me with the tip of its horn. I was fortunate that the horns weren't evenly shaped, otherwise, it could have pierced through me. Even if it hadn't killed me on the spot, the subsequent bleeding would have been relentless. I immediately took off my vest, tore it into strips, and tightly wrapped the wound, gritting my teeth to suppress my cries of pain. This was the first time I had sustained such a severe injury since arriving on the island, and blood continued to seep out. Meanwhile, Kunkin's battle was still ongoing. Chapter 54, The Goat. After quickly tending to my injuries, I couldn't pay attention to the bleeding wound and staggered to my feet. Kunkin, still a juvenile brown bear, had just used its momentum to take down the goat, but now it seemed a bit out of breath as the goat slowly struggled to rise. Worried that Kunkin might get hurt, I dragged my injured right leg over and sharply stabbed the goat's neck with the tip of my machete. Instantly, the goat thrashed violently, blood staining the ground. I quickly pulled the frantic Kunkin away and stepped aside to observe. After nearly 10 minutes of struggling, the wild goat finally succumbed to the clutches of Kunkin and me, its eyes wide open, head hanging limply, completely still. I sighed in relief, followed by a wave of fear. I never expected that a herbivorous goat could display such fierce resistance at the brink of death. Indeed, even a rabbit can bite when cornered. Thankfully, after I paid with a leg, I triumphed over this goat. I carefully checked Kunkin's body and found that, apart from its blood-soaked mouth, it was unharmed. The blood was all from the goat. I needed to return to camp quickly to find the first aid kit to treat my injury, otherwise, an infection would be troublesome. I untied the rope that was around the now lifeless goat's leg and pulled it, discovering it was quite heavy, at least 100 pounds. With my injured leg, I couldn't carry the goat on my shoulder. So, I took down the sturdy rope from the trap, which was about 5 meters long. I tied one end around the goat's neck and the other around my waist, using a stick as a cane, and limped toward the camp. Luckily, I had repaired the path, otherwise, dragging such a heavy goat would have taken me much longer to return. Kunkin quietly followed me, glancing back at the goat occasionally, as if to prevent it from suddenly rising again, to wreak havoc. At this moment, we both looked quite disheveled, covered in dirt, leaves, and dry grass. I limped along like a bear and a lame man, in a comical combination. It took me over 4 hours to reach the camp with my injury, and it was getting close to evening. I couldn't afford to rest. After treating my wound, I needed to process the goat as quickly as possible, or it would spoil in the island's hot weather. I placed the goat at the entrance and got up to find the first aid kit. First, I washed the wound with boiled clean water, rinsing off the blood and scabs. The wound was slightly red and inflamed, so I sprinkled some salt on it, which made me tear up with pain. My fists pounded the ground, and after a while, the pain finally eased. I broke open 2 anti-inflammatory pills, sprinkled the powder on the wound, and took another antibiotic. Some may wonder why I didn't give Gao Deming these medications earlier. The first aid kit only contained anti-inflammatory drugs and antibiotics. The anti-inflammatory pills were clearly for reducing inflammation, while antibiotics primarily combat infections. However, Gao was suffering from high fever, dehydration, and lack of food at the time, rendering these medications ineffective. It was more reasonable to say he died from weakness due to the fever combined with lack of water and food, rather than from illness. After treating my wound, it was time to deal with my spoils. I painstakingly skinned the goat, which was why I had risked getting into such a dangerous situation. Once I cleaned and dried the skin, I planned to lay it in Kunkin's den. Then, I gutted the goat. The innards were all edible and shouldn't go to waste. I chopped up some inedible parts into small pieces and tossed them into the potato field as fertilizer. It took me over an hour to process the large goat. I started a fire with a magnesium rod. Since I had no strength left to drill for firewood. At this moment, I felt that my earlier decision to only use the magnesium rod in emergencies was indeed correct. There was enough meat to feed Kunkin and me for a long time, so it all needed to be processed. The simplest way was to rub salt on it to cure and air dry it, but I didn't have enough salt. Furthermore, with the recent frequent rains, the meat could spoil with the slightest negligence. So, I thought of another method, smoking the meat. Luckily, I had a warehouse to utilize. The old warehouse I built had been well designed for rain protection and airtightness, making it perfect for smoking meat. I gathered a lot of fresh branches, dry bamboo, and charcoal, starting a fire inside. Adding fresh branches to the fire produced a large amount of smoke. I then salted the cut-up goat meat lightly, hung it from the ceiling, and closed the warehouse door, letting the thick smoke billow up through the gaps. Smoking the meat would require at least 7 continuous days, with 3 to 4 hours of smoking each day for long-term preservation. After processing the goat, it had grown dark, and it was time to enjoy the feast. I saved a hind leg, a piece of tenderloin, and the goat's head. I also cut off some of the fatty parts, intending to render the fat for storage, as goat fat has many uses. I scored the large leg of goat and made a simple wooden grill with 2 sticks supporting a crossbeam. I then placed the leg on top to roast, sprinkling it with collected Sichuan pepper, star anise powder, and salt, constantly turning it to prevent charring. As for the tenderloin, I planned to make pot meat, similar to Xinjiang's tea-jar meat. I cut the meat into suitable sizes, added fresh water to the clay pot, and included wild ginger, pepper, star anise, dried chili, lemon slices, and radish pieces. These seasonings were limited in quantity, and I usually hesitated to use them. I then covered the pot to simmer. I cooked 2 large clay pots because Kunkin needed a lot to eat. I didn't know how long it took, but the aroma of the roasted goat leg wafted through the air first. As I smelled it, tears nearly streamed down my face. It was a familiar yet somewhat strange scent of roasted goat, and I could no longer hold back. I grabbed the machete and sliced off a piece of roasted goat meat, too eager to care about the heat, shoving it into my mouth and enjoying it with my eyes closed. The meat was a bit tough, likely because the goat was older, but it didn't detract from the rich, thick flavor with a hint of grassiness that lingered on my taste buds. Chapter 55, Delicacies. Kunkin had been eyeing the leg of lamb roasting over the fire for a long time. It looked like a little puppy, squatting beside me, patiently waiting. When it saw me enjoying the first bite of the spoils, it became restless, making soft, hum sounds. As I chewed, I reassured Kunkin, "Don't rush, little one. There's plenty for you." I sliced off a generous piece of lamb and handed it to Kunkin, who snapped it up in one bite, swallowing it whole. It must be its first time tasting something this delicious because its bare eyes lit up, and it started making those little sounds again, urging me to feed it more. Of course, I wasn't stingy. Kunkin had played a big part in catching this goat, after all. I kept cutting pieces of meat with my machete and feeding them to Kunkin. Now, this machete is over half a meter long, and cutting lamb with it wasn't exactly easy. I wished I had a smaller, sharper knife. Secretly, I resolved to forge a dagger once my injury healed and I could make use of the metal-rich ores nearby. Half an hour later, the leg of lamb was nearly gone, most of it devoured by this little glutton. The lamb tenderloin simmering in the pottery jar should be ready by now, but I wasn't very hungry anymore, so I decided to let it cook a bit longer to make it even more tender. There were 3 pottery jars boiling over the fire, 2 filled with lamb tenderloin and the other with lamb fat, slowly rendering down into oil. I opened the jar of fat, and the lamb oil inside had melted, bubbling gently with bits of charred residue swirling around. Using chopsticks, I fished out the residue and added more fat to continue rendering. This lamb oil would be useful for cooking and, more importantly, for making candles. My little wooden house was pitch dark every night, and I avoided lighting a fire indoors for fear of carbon monoxide poisoning. But with candles, everything would change. I could do more at night, maybe even make lanterns, and I wouldn't have to be anxious when making late-night bathroom trips. Speaking of bathroom trips, let me share a little story that happened one night. I had a bad stomachache and went outside to the toilet in the dark. I grabbed a burning stick from the fire for light. But when you're squatting with diarrhea, it takes a while. After some time, a gust of wind blew out the burning stick, plunging me into darkness. I felt uneasy, sensing something behind me. Suddenly, I felt a furry paw land on my shoulder. My heart raced with fear. I remembered childhood stories of wolves that placed their paws on travelers' shoulders before going for the throat. Terrified, I ran for my life without even pulling up my pants, hearing something chasing after me. When I finally reached the house and looked back, I realized that the wolf was actually Kunkin, a dark, furry bear. I thought to myself, why is this silly bear following me to the toilet instead of sleeping? After rendering 3 full jars of lamb oil, I figured the pottery jar meat was ready. I opened one of the jars, and a rich aroma of lamb mixed with spices wafted up. I poked the tenderloin with my chopsticks, it felt as soft as cotton. Using leaves to lift the jar, I pulled out a piece of lamb, tender and falling off the bone. I blew on it before taking a bite. The meat melted in my mouth, fresh and fragrant. It was incredibly delicious. I took a sip of the lamb soup. It was hot and salty, with a slight gamey taste. A warmth spread through my body, making me feel like my wounds were healing faster. Kunkin and I each finished a jar of the pottery jar meat. I thought about giving Kunkin more, but it looked stuffed, letting out a few loud burps. Thinking it might be choking, I hurriedly patted its back, but it just chewed. The meaton looked at me, puzzled, as if asking, "Why are you patting me?" Seeing its round belly, I decided it had eaten enough. We ate until midnight. By then, the small animals on the island were probably asleep. The only sounds were the occasional hoots of owls deep in the forest and the crackling of the fire beside me. After finishing its meal, Kunkin got up, stretched lazily, and waddled back to its nest, falling asleep almost instantly. I looked at this silly bear, fast asleep, while I was too full to feel drowsy. I glanced at my wound, noticing it was a bit red and swollen. Suddenly, I remembered, isn't lamb considered a heaty food? I had just eaten a belly full of lamb, right after my injury. It felt like I was tempting fate. An old saying came to mind, the old longevity god hangs himself, complaining about living too long. I couldn't help but feel even more awake. Still, who could blame me? After a year without a decent meal, anyone would indulge without thinking of the consequences. With limited medical supplies left on the island, an infection would be a serious problem. I quickly took another anti-inflammatory pill and an antibiotic, resolving not to eat lamb tomorrow. Unable to sleep, I added more branches to the fire and began working on my candles. I found a thin bamboo stalk, cut a section with nodes, and filled it with lamb oil. The oil had already solidified into a white, waxy substance. I melted it again and poured it into the bamboo. Then, I twisted soft tree bark and dry grass into a thin wick, placing it inside, with a small piece sticking out. A simple candle was born. When I lit it, the flame burned steadily, releasing a faint scent of lamb. I took the candle inside, and the small room was instantly filled with a warm, gentle glow and a unique aroma. I noticed Kunkin's nose twitching in its sleep, licking its lips. I swear, this bear must have been dreaming about eating lamb. Although the candle burned well at first, once the top layer of lamb oil was consumed, the flame began to dim as the oil level dropped. The bamboo walls were too thick, preventing the flame from burning evenly. It seemed bamboo wasn't the right material for candle making. I needed a better solution. After pondering for a while, I suddenly remembered the old-style lamp bowls people used in ancient times. I smacked my head, why hadn't I thought of this earlier? I could just make a pottery lamp. Clearly, it was time for bed. I had wasted too much energy on such a simple problem. Exhausted, I lay down, and as soon as I closed my eyes, I drifted into a deep, peaceful sleep. Chapter 56, The Daily Life of an Injured Man. March 11th. I woke up quite late today, and surprisingly, Kunkin didn't rise early to beg for food as usual, probably because it was too full from last night's meal. When I finally woke around noon, I discovered a beautiful little bird perched on my stomach. Kong Kong saw that I was awake, glanced at me, and greeted me with a melodious, "Good morning." I smiled and replied, "Good morning, Kong Kong." After getting up, I fed the bird 2 bamboo worms I had saved in a jar, then checked my wound. While the injury was still a bit red, it had started to scab over slightly. It shouldn't be a major issue, but I certainly can't work for the next few days, better to stay home and recover. Fortunately, my food supply is abundant now. I have plenty of dried salted fish, snake jerky, dried bananas, raisins, 2 jars of honey, a small pile of chestnuts, and a few well-fed wild rabbits in the rabbit pen. My injury won't prevent me from fishing at the coast, so there's more than enough food for Kunkin and me to get by for a while. In the storeroom, I lit some fresh branches, allowing the smoke to envelop the mutton hanging from the ceiling. This will become part of my daily routine for the next few days. After closing the door, I leaned on my wooden stick and sat under the canopy, contemplating what I could do. Heavy tasks like road construction were out of the question. Recently, I noticed that cooking with those clay pots is inconvenient, especially when preparing mutton. The pots are too small, and I often have to use several at once. I decided to create a few proper cooking pots and a food bowl for Kunkin. While I'm at it, I'll make bowls for Xiao Yuer and Kong Kong too. Right now, they're eating off the ground, which is neither clean nor hygienic, and it lacks that sense of ceremony. Leaning on my stick and limping, I fetched a bag of yellow clay and set about crafting various pottery. Round pots, flat-bottomed pots, soup pots, in different sizes of food bowls, water basins, and earthen jars. My new kiln is spacious enough to fire multiple pieces at once. Finally, with the leftover materials, I sculpted 2 small terracotta warriors, spending 4 days drying and firing them. March 15th, I distributed the fired pottery. Kong Kong and Xiao Yuer each received a food bowl in front of their nests, while Kunkun's bowl was placed beside the outdoor fire pit. This guy makes such a mess when he eats, scattering food scraps everywhere. During this time, I also constructed a bamboo reclining chair. It's much more comfortable than the previous one I made, which creaked in several spots. Oh, and about those 2 terracotta warriors I made, everyone knows I lack artistic talent. Once fired, they turned out lopsided, barely resembling human figures. I placed them on the square table inside my hut as art to admire. My injury has improved significantly. The wound is scabbing over, the surrounding area is no longer red, and I can apply a bit more pressure on my leg while walking. I've stopped taking anti-inflammatory and antibiotic pills, though I still don't dare to engage in heavy work since the wound is deep. March 16th. The grapevines I transplanted behind the wooden house have begun to bear fruit. A thought suddenly crossed my mind: why not try making some wine from these grapes? Fermenting wine relies on wild yeast microbes that naturally grow on the surface of grapes, so there's no need to worry about adding yeast. I picked a small bunch of grapes and washed them gently with clean water. You can't scrub them too hard, or you'll remove the white powder on the surface. That's where the wild yeast microbes are. Then, I found a clay pot and poured boiling water over it inside and out to disinfect it. Next, I placed the washed grapes into the clay pot and mashed them with a clean bamboo stick. You may have heard of some French estates where young women crush grapes with their bare feet in wooden barrels. Rumor has it that wine made this way has a richer flavor. I looked down at my own feet, with long toenails, and decided against the idea. Glancing at Kunkun's muddy bare paws, I determined that using the stick was a better option. Perhaps this wine will carry a faint bamboo fragrance, though I later discovered this notion was nonsensical. After mashing the grapes, I added sugar. Grapes naturally contain some sugar, but not enough for fermentation, so sugar is essential to help the yeast convert the grape juice into alcohol and carbon dioxide. The sugar also balances out the tartness of the juice. I didn't have white sugar, but I did have brown sugar, I refined from sugarcane. As long as it contains sugar, it should work. The ratio of sugar to grapes is about 2:8 or 3:7. The more sugar, the higher the alcohol content. Concerned that the brown sugar might not be sweet enough, I added a bit extra. I stirred the grape pulp and sugar together, covered the pot, and sealed it with yellow clay. Now it's just a matter of waiting about 40 days for the wine to ferment. This method of winemaking is a traditional homemade approach. I've tried it before at home. The wine turns out a bit cloudy, sweet, and quite strong, but it's easy to overdo it. However, research shows that homemade wine like this can harbor excessive bacteria and might contain methanol, which can lead to blindness in extreme cases, so please don't try this at home. I stored the clay pot in my new warehouse, where it's cool and out of direct sunlight. Since this is my first attempt, I only made 1 pot. If it succeeds, I'll make more wine in the future. Life on the island is becoming more comfortable. I've explored over half of the island's regions. I can now claim that I've achieved food freedom, with a diverse and abundant food supply, a big house to live in, and 3 companions. Each day feels more promising. Once my leg fully heals, I'll explore the rest of the island and transition from survival to enjoyment. Once I've secured all my needs, I plan to build a sturdy small boat, stock up on enough food, and visit the nearby island. Perhaps I'll find signs of human activity there. Though the odds are slim, so far, I haven't seen any passing ships or planes. I've never given up hope of escaping, even though I've grown fond of this island. Chapter 57, Chisha Beach, a gathering of sea turtles. March 15th, my injury has healed. Although the scab on my wound hasn't completely fallen off, I no longer feel pain when using my thigh. I am beginning to return to my regular work, focusing on road construction and the development of Swan Lake. I've decided to avoid the wild goats that once seemed harmless. The experience I had with them left a lasting impression on me. However, I've noticed that several of the female goats in the grass now have round bellies, suggesting they might be pregnant. I plan to wait for this batch of kids to be born and see if I can catch and tame them. On March 20th, after 2 days of continuous rain on the island, the weather cleared up today, with no wind. I plan to take Kunkin to explore the northern beach again. Recently, while repairing the road near the southern edge of the forest, I often encountered signs of leopards. Fortunately, these cautious creatures didn't attack me, but this has made it difficult to access the southwestern beach, which is littered with ocean debris. I packed my gear, bringing enough food and fresh water for Kunkin and myself for 3 days, along with a backpack, bow and arrow, and a large machete. Taking advantage of the rising tide, I dragged the bamboo raft out and headed south. The journey went smoothly, we didn't encounter any sharks or leopards. By dusk, we landed on the northwestern beach once again. The beach looked much like it did during my last visit. The tide had washed away many items while bringing in a variety of new ones. I scanned the area and didn't see the urn from last time. Instead, I collected several plastic bottles and 3 iron buckets, all of which leaked and were unsuitable for storing fresh water. I gathered various floating objects, such as foam and large plastic balls, which I plan to use as fishing net floats. My intention is to use these buoyant items to build a small boat to explore a nearby island. After filling my bamboo raft with items, I ventured into the nearby forest. Since there are many leopards living here, I didn't dare go deep inside and only walked along the forest's edge. However, I didn't return empty-handed. I discovered a jujube tree, scientifically known as Ziziphus jujuba, whose fruit is sweet as honey. The tree wasn't large, and there weren't many fruits on it. After picking the fruit, I dug around the roots and uprooted the entire tree, planning to transplant it near the wooden house. With Kunkin by my side, I didn't feel as scared at night. I built a campfire, and after dinner, I snuggled up with Kunkin to sleep. Kunkin was warm, and its fur was soft, but the only downside was its loud snoring. The next morning, since I wasn't sleeping in a bed, I woke up feeling sore all over. I stretched my neck, making creaking noises, and felt somewhat stiff. Kunkin, however, was curled up, sleeping soundly. Facing the sea, I stretched and suddenly noticed a large group of round objects moving on the beach. Upon closer inspection, wow! So many large sea turtles. These turtles were enormous, resembling moving boulders. They had come to the beach in groups with the rising tide, and it seemed many were laying eggs. Today is truly my lucky day. As I approached a little closer, I found that these turtles weren't afraid of me at all. They continued with their activities. Some turtles buried their eggs using their back legs after laying them. Holding my machete, I watched these adorable creatures, feeling hesitant to take action. How could I eat such cute sea turtles? After about half an hour, I had a freshly slaughtered large sea turtle on my bamboo raft. This turtle was very heavy and difficult to move. I nearly strained my back trying to get it onto the raft. My backpack was filled with turtle eggs, and after tasting them with Kunkin, I found them incredibly delicious, tender and fragrant, far superior to chicken, bird, duck, and even ostrich eggs. I tried one raw, and it was sweet with no fishy taste at all. As for this sea turtle, I plan to take it back to camp to eat. If I don't hurry, I'll have to spend another night on the beach. The raft was loaded with heavy items, and the waterline had dropped significantly. With Kunkin, this big, chubby bear, paddling became especially laborious. At first, the raft barely moved, but as I gradually got the hang of it, we sped up. Finally, as dusk approached, we made it back to camp. The tide had not yet fully risen, and the shoreline was still a bit distant from the beach. I exerted myself tremendously to haul the raft and supplies up, while also pondering whether I could make a small cart. To save time, Kunkin and I didn't eat lunch. Now, I was eyeing the massive sea turtle, drooling. Although this turtle was huge, the smallest one I found on the beach weighed almost 200 pounds, primarily due to its heavy shell. I could only slowly lift one side and roll it to move. I doubt I could even lift a side of the larger ones. I feel it necessary to clarify that I swear I have never eaten sea turtle before this. Sea turtles are a nationally protected species, and capturing, slaughtering, or selling them is illegal. However, I currently don't know where I am. It's definitely not within the country, and I am alone on the entire island, so I'm not worried about breaking any laws. Moreover, there are so many of these sea turtles that even if I ate one every day, I'd likely never finish them all. After great effort, I finally broke through the turtle's hard, relatively weak inner shell and began to cut the meat. This turtle had presumably already laid its eggs, as I found no turtle eggs inside. Despite its nearly 200 pounds of weight, the cut meat amounted to only about 50 or 60 pounds, even less than the meat from a goat. I placed the two thickest back legs of the turtle on the fire to roast, then cut a chunk of meat from its belly into small pieces to put into my newly crafted soup pot, and added spices to stew. 2 hours later, the meat was cooked. Since sea turtles are protected animals, I won't elaborate on the taste to avoid enticing any readers to rush out and do something rash. That would be a great sin. I can only say that the turtle was the most delicious meat I've ever eaten. By the time I finished dinner, it was already late. Tonight, the moon was full and reflecting bright moonlight. I stayed up late to marinate the remaining turtle meat and hung it in the smokehouse, curing it alongside the goat meat. After days of smoking, the goat meat had turned golden and glossy, presenting an enticing cured meat appearance. Chapter 58, Tree Climbing Bear and Fishing Bear. March 22nd. After breakfast, I planted the jujube tree I had brought back from Chisha Beach, just a short distance from the potato field. The potato plants were thriving, their robust growth painted the landscape in vibrant green. Soon, these potatoes would be ready for harvest. When some of the stems and leaves began to turn from green to yellow, wilting gently, the creeping stems would shrink, and the tuber skins would form a thick, woody layer. This signaled the end of the potatoes' growth, marking the perfect time for harvest. Witnessing this flourishing scene lifted my spirits, filling me with renewed hope. Meanwhile, I sensed it was time to plant rice. The dry season on the island had passed, and recent light rains had increased the water flow in the gaps of the Rocky Mountains. Some plants that had looked wilted were beginning to perk up. That afternoon, I retrieved a pottery jar from the warehouse, filled with the golden, plump rice I had saved. I brought the jar to the rice field I had prepared earlier. After surveying the area, I found the environment ideal, with ample water flow. Even during the dry season, the water wouldn't run dry. I spent the entire afternoon planting the rice, this time without reservations. Having gained experience, I was confident that I wouldn't face any setbacks. Like last time, I fashioned a proper scarecrow to place in the field. Although I was uncertain about its effectiveness, the results from the potato field suggested it might work, as I rarely spotted birds venturing into the area. March 23rd. Today, I took Kunkin with me to fish at Swan Lake. As we passed a tree I had previously discovered with a beehive, I was astonished to see a bear climbing it on all fours. My curiosity piqued. At first, I thought it might be Shangda, but upon closer inspection, I realized this bear looked entirely different, larger and with a different fur color. I admired the bravery of this brown bear. When it reached the beehive, I decided to step back. The bees had built it too high, and the branches appeared unstable. The brown bear quickly climbed to the hive. It swatted at it several times, and then with a loud thud, the beehive plummeted to the ground, spilling honeycombs everywhere, with bright yellow honey gleaming enticingly. Seeing the fallen beehive nearby ignited an impulse to rush over and grab it, but I ultimately restrained myself. After all, my 3 beehives continuously produced honey, so it wasn't worth doing something so unethical for a mere bit of honey. The tree-climbing bear hurried down the tree, glancing left and right as it descended. I couldn't tell if it was drawn by the honey or stung by the bees. I guessed it was likely the former. After a moment, it finally reached the ground and immediately approached the beehive, completely unaware that Kunkin and I were watching. It plopped down, lifted a piece of honeycomb with its front paws, and began to chew, honey dribbling from the corners of its mouth. The way the tree-climbing bear devoured the honeycomb mirrored Kunkin's style. It didn't even spit out the wax. In less than 5 or 6 minutes, it finished off a sizable chunk of the beehive, stood on all fours, and bent down to lick the honey from the ground, even eating the sand stuck to it. I couldn't help but glance at Kunkin beside me, thinking, did you see that? This little bear is so happy under my care. Look at that bear, it's even eating dirt. I wondered what Kunkin was thinking when, suddenly, the tree-climbing bear, having finished its feast, wiggled its behind and prepared to leave. Without warning, Kunkin dashed toward it, and I didn't have time to stop him. I was taken aback. Kunkin was truly unpredictable. The tree-climbing bear heard the noise behind it and noticed both Kunkin and me. It stood still, appearing somewhat suspicious. Although bears typically don't show much expression, I imagined it was questioning our presence. Luckily, the tree-climbing bear didn't exhibit any signs of aggression toward me. Soon, Kunkin ran up to the tree-climbing bear. Perhaps due to their kinship as bears and Kunkin being shorter, he posed no threat. The two bears began to sniff each other, and I realized that bears share habits similar to dogs, greeting one another through scent. After their introductions, they seemed to recognize each other as fellow bears and visibly relaxed. However, the tree-climbing bear occasionally glanced my way, as if pondering, what is this two-legged creature? Kunkin played with the tree-climbing bear for quite some time. Eventually, growing impatient, I called Kunkin back, and the two bears reluctantly parted ways. I led Kunkin onward to Swan Lake. When we arrived at the lake, I spotted yet another bear in the distance. I was puzzled by my extraordinary luck with bears today. Usually, I wouldn't see a single one. From my distance, I couldn't discern its features, but it appeared large, undoubtedly an adult brown bear, instilling a sense of unease in me. Not all brown bears are docile. If this bear had a fierce temperament and didn't respect Kunkin, I could be in danger. So, I held Kunkin back and quietly observed from afar. This bear was fishing by the lake. It seemed to be in a shallow area, standing in the water on its hind legs, quietly waiting with its front paws raised in a comical posture. After more than 10 minutes, it suddenly plunged its front paws into the water as if pressing down on something, then opened its mouth wide to catch whatever was there. I watched as a large fish was firmly clamped in the fishing bear's jaws, the fish thrashing and struggling. After capturing the fish, the fishing bear turned and left. I noted that whether it was Shangda, the tree-climbing bear, or the fishing bear, they all headed north toward the mountains. I guess these bears preferred to build their dens in higher terrain. My curiosity surged. I had climbed mountains many times, yet I hadn't encountered any brown bear dens. Where could they be? Driven by curiosity, I held Kunkin and followed the fishing bear from a distance. I desperately wanted to know where these creatures lived and what a wild brown bear's den looked like. Could it be a giant bird's nest too? Chapter 59, The Cave. I crouched low, like a guerrilla fighter, holding onto Kunkin as we trailed behind the brown bear from a distance. Thankfully, this bear was massive and had a clear destination, making it easy for me to keep up. The bear lumbered northwest through the grass, gradually ascending a slope that led closer to the mountainside. The ground was becoming rockier, with more stones scattered across the muddy earth. After about 30 minutes, I came upon a jumble of rocks of various sizes leaning against the mountain, forming a cliff-like structure. The fishing bear began to climb, prompting me to halt Kunkin and gaze upward at it. Although the brown bear appeared clumsy, it was surprisingly agile, moving gracefully over the large boulders like a scene from Kung Fu Panda. After about 15 minutes, it squeezed into a sizable crevice and vanished from view. So this is where they live. I glanced around, realizing this was indeed a very secluded and sheltered spot, perfect for protection against the wind and rain. I noticed numerous large rock crevices resembling bear dens, and to the east, I spotted a dark cave in the mountainside. My curiosity was piqued again. I desperately wanted to explore inside. However, I decided to postpone that thought until tomorrow, as my gear wasn't adequate. After memorizing the route, I led Kunkin back to Swan Lake to fish. This time, I chose a new spot, the area where the fishing bear caught its prey. The water was shallower with a gentle slope, and I easily caught a carp and a hefty silver carp weighing over a dozen pounds. After a busy day, I started making a lantern that evening, preparing for tomorrow's exploration of the large cave. Among the pottery I had fired, there were 2 shallow lanterns designed like small plates, featuring a central post to hold the wick. I lit the wick to test it, and it worked quite well. Additionally, there was a round, hollow piece of pottery shaped like a pumpkin. I carved 2 large holes on either side, scooped out the flesh, and placed a lantern inside, creating a simple lantern. I found a piece of bamboo for the handle, collected some tree bark, crushed it, and twisted the fibers into strips to weave 4 sturdy yet flexible ropes to secure the lantern. Eagerly, I lit the wick and took the lantern outside to test it, only to find the brightness was low, illuminating a very limited area. Suddenly, a gust of wind blew, and the wick quietly extinguished. I felt defeated. This contraption was definitely not windproof. I didn't have glass, but I did possess some transparent plastic from a bag I found on West Beach. However, the lantern's brightness was already insufficient, and adding the plastic made it worse. I stood outside, staring blankly at the extinguished lantern in my hands, my mind racing for solutions. Finally, in frustration, I discarded the lantern. The pottery shattered on the ground into several pieces, but I didn't mind at all, muttering, "What a useless piece of junk." The lantern I had painstakingly created was less effective than a torch. I realized I had overcomplicated things, perhaps out of boredom, always trying to tinker with strange ideas. In the end, I found a piece of wood, shaped it with my axe, wrapped one end with dry vines and dead grass, drenched it in lamb fat, and lit it on fire. The flame instantly illuminated the surroundings, and it was fairly windproof. As long as the wind wasn't too strong, the fat-soaked torch wouldn't be extinguished. How simple is this? Why did I waste time and energy on that useless thing? I thought to myself. I tested the burning time of this torch. Although I had no watch to time it, I estimated it would last around 10 minutes, which was more than sufficient. March 24th. In the morning, I packed my bow and arrows, took my machete, torch, and magnesium stick, and led Kunkin toward the cave I discovered yesterday. After about 2 hours, we arrived at the cave's entrance. I looked at this dark opening, which was half a head taller than me, and felt a surge of fear, a desire to back out. I thought to myself that friends who had been in caves surely understood the fear of facing unknown darkness, always feeling like there were monsters lurking within. Just as I contemplated giving up, Kunkin, distracted by my hesitation, broke free from the rope and dashed inside. I was startled, completely losing my grip. "Kunkin, come back," I shouted, but unfortunately, this ungrateful child didn't listen at all and vanished into the darkness within seconds. It was already dark, and with a black bear running in, it was even darker. I couldn't see anything. After a short while, I suddenly heard Kunkin growl softly, followed by a rustling sound, like two animals wrestling on the ground. Panic set in. What if this was the den of a large animal? Kunkin, being just a juvenile bear, wouldn't stand a chance. Driven by a protective instinct, I quickly took out the magnesium stick, ignited the torch, and bravely rushed inside. The sunlight gradually faded until it completely disappeared, and the flickering light of the torch illuminated the surrounding stone walls, amplifying the cave's eerie atmosphere. A strong, foul odor filled the cave, and I was certain some creature lived here. I wondered if it was a bear, perhaps a leopard, or even something I had never seen before. At that moment, Kunkin's growling stopped, only a faint rustling sound remained. My heart raced, and fear gripped me. Had my bear just been killed? Was that executioner now gnawing on Kunkin's flesh? Rage surged through me. Although I wasn't married and didn't know what it felt like to be a parent, I had treated that little guy like my own child. Now that he was in danger, I felt like I didn't want to live anymore. As adrenaline coursed through me, grief and anger overshadowed my fear. I shouted, "Kunkin," and raised my machete, charging recklessly into the cave. Chapter 60, Niter. I roared, "Ah!" and charged into the cave, brandishing my machete. In my haste to prepare for a potential fight, I tossed aside my backpack and bow, almost throwing my torch as well, only keeping it for the light it provided. The cave wasn't deep. Just a few steps in, I encountered a corner. I quickly reached the innermost part, but when I turned that corner, the sight before me left me momentarily stunned. There, I saw two brown bears, one large and one small, embracing each other and licking one another's fur. The rustling sound I had heard earlier was from them. The smaller one was obviously Kunkin, while the larger one was Shangda. Both bears halted their actions upon my sudden intrusion, turning to look at me. Our eyes met, and in that moment, I felt a peculiar connection, as if they were wondering, "What are you doing here? What's with that pose? Who were you trying to scare with that loud shout earlier?" It turned out to be a false alarm. My arms went limp, and the machete slipped from my grip. The courage I had mustered was forced, and now that my nerves had relaxed, I suddenly felt fatigue, a dull throb echoing in my head. I realized I had accidentally stumbled into Shangda's lair, and this fellow showed no hospitality at all. He merely glanced at me before ignoring me completely, not even offering a, "Please, go ahead." Regaining my composure, I began to survey Shangda's home. The cave was permeated by a strong odor, a mix of fishiness and a faint hint of salted fish. There were no real furnishings, just dry branches and leaves scattered across the ground, which Shangda had likely dragged back for bedding. Fish bones littered the area, and in the corner, I spotted a broken salted fish head. Holding the torch high, I inspected the surroundings and noticed glimmering stones on the cave walls. I wondered if they might be gems. When I tried to pry one off, I found I couldn't. I was hesitant to use my machete to dig, fearing I might damage Shangda's home. The smell inside was unbearable, and having found nothing particularly interesting, I dashed outside for some fresh air. Sitting at the entrance, I gazed up at the beautiful sky, lost in thought. If only I had a smartphone to show my friends the background behind me, a brown bear's cave. Guess what's inside? That's right, 2 bears. One of whom I raised myself. Ellipsis. After a moment of daydreaming, I snapped back to reality, puzzled as to why Kunkin hadn't come out yet. The cave was dark and stinky. I couldn't understand why he would want to stay in there. Yet I didn't want to leave either, worried that Kunkin might not find me and could get lost, which would be a real hassle. As I pondered, I suddenly remembered the glimmering objects I had seen in the cave. Could they be diamonds? If they really were diamonds, I could strike it rich. My excitement surged as I walked back to the cave entrance for another look. Sure enough, the glowing materials were on the wall near the entrance. However, upon closer inspection, I confirmed they weren't diamonds. Instead, they were grayish-white crystals, some large and some small. I felt a wave of disappointment wash over me. My dreams of wealth had been dashed. I pried off a small piece, about the size of 2 thumbs, and found it surprisingly light in my hand, with a low density. Scraping it with my nail, I discovered it was soft, somewhat like gypsum. I guessed it might be quartz or fluorite, but after further examination, I realized it was neither. My curiosity piqued. What on earth was this? With nothing better to do, I used the tip of my machete to pry off a few more pieces from the wall and studied them for a while, but couldn't identify them. Randomly, I picked up 2 stones and knocked them together, producing sparks. Suddenly, I realized, could this be niter? While many stones can produce sparks when struck together, such as flint or sapphire, those stones are hard and easily recognizable. But these stones in my hand were both light and soft, leading me to nearly confirm that they were indeed niter. Though I hadn't had much experience with niter, I remembered playing with wall niter as a child, the white frost seeping from walls in my hometown. We would collect it and ignite it with matches, creating little fireworks. Later, I learned that niter could also be used to make ice, as the ice blocks used by ancient emperors in summer were supposedly derived from it. Though I've tried it and it didn't produce ice, it just made the water very cold, so I remained skeptical of that claim. This was truly a great fortune. This false alarm today wasn't in vain, as the applications of niter are incredibly broad. Not only can it be used to make ice, but more importantly, it's one of the main components of black powder. With this miraculous powder, what could I possibly fear from leopards or brown bears? Moreover, niter itself is a type of medicinal material that can clear heat, detoxify, stop vomiting, and relieve discomfort caused by heat toxins. The humid climate of the island sometimes causes me to experience these symptoms, so having niter will make my life considerably more comfortable. I immediately sprang into action, ready to demolish at the entrance of Shangda's house. I wielded my machete and began digging up the grayish-white crystals, quickly accumulating a small pile. Shangda seemed to sense the commotion and ventured out to investigate, growling at me a few times, likely thinking, "Is this guy tearing down my house? Should I take a bite out of him?" As I looked at the small pile of niter on the ground, which weighed about a pound, I decided to stop for now. I would take this back to experiment with. If I was wrong and it wasn't niter, I'd be disappointed, and I'd have damaged Shangda's home in vain. Afterward, I continued digging in the surrounding soil and discovered that niter not only existed in Shangda's walls but also in the dry soil nearby. This discovery thrilled me. It meant I wouldn't have to risk digging in Shangda's home anymore. avoiding the chance of provoking him one day and facing his wrath, that wouldn't be worth it.